the government and the Niti Aayog has put out a headline claim, which has been all over the media. I'll start with you, Saugata, to ask you to explain to our viewers what is this survey and why is it so significant? Why are all of us debating this?
So, thank you, Siddharth, for having me on your show once again. Two or three things that is very, very critical about this survey. One, on the growth side, remember the GDP data that we normally use to measure growth, to understand growth, does not have a separate rural and urban distinction. This survey, all in fact, other expenditure surveys that were held before and other consumer expenditure surveys distinguishes between urban and rural. So this is the first very important thing, which gives you an idea. Because remember, I mean, there's been a huge amount of vague narrative about weakness in rural growth, etc. Number two, which is very, very important, not just from a growth perspective, but also from a policy perspective, is that the periodic, typically it used to be every 5 years. This period has been lengthened a little bit. So the CPI basket on which the various commodities that go into the inflation index, the consumer inflation index, is sourced from these consumption surveys. And remember that CPI is of critical importance in the setting of monetary policy, setting interest rates, which is a big guiding factor in the growth dynamics. So these are the two critical important issues on the broad macroeconomic sense. Third, more important, is the distinction between the various categories of consumption, as you very correctly pointed out in your opening statement. This enables us to understand in far more granular detail how consumption in the rural and urban areas are progressing, and how, given the real and the nominal growth, how do we interpret this in terms of the relative inflation basket. So these are the three critical important areas for in which the MPCE numbers need to be seen.
Household spending has doubled in the past decade. And the second point that I would like to attach to that is strong rural consumption is outpacing urban spends. Siddharth also spoke about, that much of the consumption is at the mass level. It is necessity linked, not luxury, but essentials. What does this tell us? Does it tell us that Bharat is not as sort of weak in economic terms that we tend to believe? Because there is another bit of data which says that most of the job creation and economic activity is happening in urban India. Saugata.
So, I mean, very, very interesting question and very interesting data relating to this. You're absolutely right. Number one, that growth, particularly in the rural area, consumption growth in the rural area has been much, much more, seems to have been much, much more robust than is typically discussed by various FMCG companies, other companies, in terms of their sales, etc., and which has been a pervasive narrative. So this seems to be a different narrative that has come up. Secondly, the more important part is that relative to the previous consumption surveys, the difference between the rural and urban per capita consumption expenditure, what is called the MPCE in this monthly per capita consumption expenditure, is in 2022-23 the lowest ever in the last four surveys that have been reflected. 71%. The difference in terms of rural expenditure is only 71%. So, in other words, the rural consumption is only about 71% lower than the urban expenditure. Typically, at the high end, it used to be 10, 12 years ago, it used to be about 90%. So that's number two. That rural consumption seems to have caught up with urban consumption. The third part is, as you said, in terms of this type of patterns of spends, more on actual necessities. It's difficult to actually understand. If you look at the survey data, also gives class by class. So the poorest, the middle income, and the richest. If you
Yeah.
see that, that's another surprise that comes in the survey. That the difference between the least the least rich, least well off, the poorest, in other words, of families in the rural and urban areas, that seems to be way lower than in the upper income categories. So my sense is, again, I mean, so these are multiple policy implications coming in from this. That how has redistribution over the last 10 years or so played a role in these numbers? We all know the government's focus on providing basic amenities, etc. And this data seems to actually suggest that these interventions have worked very, very well.